Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast, hosted by my partner in compliance and good friend Lisa Fine, whose day job is at Pearson, and me, Mary Shirley. My 9 to 5 is with Precedes Medical Care. Today, I'm very pleased to present a podcast episode that is sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights, a fantastic place to go to get news and resources and learn more about the latest in compliance. Today, we're joined by Beth Colling, a legal and compliance veteran who's based in both Charlotte and Boston in the United States. Welcome, Beth. Tell us about your career journey that took you to your current position as Chief Compliance Officer at CDM Smith, an engineering and construction multinational.
Hi, Mary, and thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Pleasure.
So, like many chief compliance officers, my background is as an attorney. And also, like many of my colleagues, we didn't start out as a compliance officer. We just sort of fell into it for some reason or another. So just a little background. Before I went to law school, I was an undergrad with a degree in journalism. This is very important because at the time I decided I was going to travel the world and be a photojournalist and just bring all the wrongs of the world back to the U.S. And this eventually comes around where I'm at with CDM Smith. But when I was in college, I had a professor who said, you would make a really good lawyer. And this was 1986, 1987. And I'm like, are you kidding me? The only thing I know about lawyers is a bunch of sharks out to sue people. And I want no part of it. But the comment came from the fact that any pieces that I wrote, he said, you're definitely trying to persuade. And so I really want you to think about it. So after trying to be a photojournalist on my own for 4 years, and my best year was an $11,000 paycheck, I said, maybe I'll look at this law school thing. And I was very fortunate enough to get into a really good school and loved it and did the usual thing after law school. I clerked for a federal judge, then went to a law firm, and then went in-house counsel. And I really enjoyed all of those moves. And then about 12 years ago, the president of the company that I was general counsel for said, we need to set up this thing called an ethics and compliance program. And I'd really like for you to step out of your role and go do this. I didn't know what the heck he was talking about as far as ethics. And I said, if this is about making people behave, I have 3 kids, a husband, and a dog, and they don't listen to me. So if I'm supposed to tell people how to behave, I don't think this is me. I'm a lawyer. I like analysis and facts. And he was like, no, there's more to it. So I agreed to do an 18-month rotation. And 12 years later, here I am. I'm still doing it.
That's great.
So I've had the really good fortune to work at some great companies. And the last several is when they came in, they asked me to join them to set up a program. So as an attorney, we don't get to build things very often, do we? Not at all. And I'm married to an engineer, and so I get to watch him build and do stuff. And that's just not in my DNA, but I started thinking, that'd be really cool. So I kind of fell into this place of building these programs, looking at the effective compliance programs, what are the elements, that sort of thing. So about 4 years ago, I was in a pretty happy place. I really wasn't looking to leave anything. And I got a call about this company in Boston. And the recruiter said, this is a really great company. They've got a great mission statement. As you noted, it's an engineering and construction multinational. They're consultants, and they do a lot of work with infrastructure, both in the U.S. and overseas. And especially in the international field, it was in developing nations. So this kind of came around in the circle with regard to my love with traveling and being this photojournalist. Is all of a sudden I got a chance to work with this company whose mission is essentially, do good. So I went to Boston. So you brought up the fact I actually live in Charlotte. which is where I moved from Virginia, brought my company here. So I went to Charlotte. So I said, okay, family's in Charlotte. I'll just go to Boston, see what it's like. And to be quite honest, my oldest daughter was in college in Boston. So I thought, well, I can see Mackenzie and see what it's all about. I absolutely fell in love with the executive team, with the way they approach compliance. And they were asking me, I said, so what are you looking for in a compliance officer, compliance program? They said, we don't know. You tell us. And all of a sudden I was like, wow, these guys are really, really vested. And then, the interview clearly went well and they offered me the job, but the job was in Boston. So I talked to my husband, talked to the 2 children still at home, and everybody said, no, Mom, sorry, we don't want to move again. So I went back and turned the job down. And the president, I initially turned this down. So the CEO of the company, who's now retired, but he just happened to have a daughter who lives right down the street from me in Charlotte. And I didn't know this. I don't know her, didn't know this. And his comment to me was, I thought you'd have a hard time leaving warm, sunny Charlotte to come to cold Boston. But what he really said is, we really bought in to what you had to say. We really feel like you're the right fit for us. So they said, well, can you come up twice a month? And I said, sure. And 4 years later, I'm still here.
That's great. And I'm glad that you found a solution and that the company was so vested in what you had to offer that they were at the forefront of finding a solution. And it was funny that you mentioned about lawyers being sharks as your reputation, because, every time I have seen you, you are just the epitome of bright and fun and cheer and everything that's good in the world.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You're a shining example of how, the old perception of lawyers is just so far behind us, and to be effective, you don't need to be one certain type of person, and very positive and cheerful. People come in all different packages and can do all sorts of different jobs. So that made me smile when you said that. Let's just say I would have been a stinky divorce attorney. I just there's some subject matter that you would not have seen a cheerful person. But thank you. I appreciate the compliment. My pleasure. So you mentioned being in the construction and engineering field and its consultancy work. And of course, you're in emerging markets and developing areas. What are some of the biggest compliance risks for companies in your space?
Well, let's start with the work we do in the United States first, because, you take a look and everybody says, well, the U.S. is a clean company. And you and I have spoken about that before, that when you take a look at the Corruption Perception Index, the companies that are the countries that score, well on it, we tend not to think, oh, they're high risk, but they are. There's just other areas. So, I first came on board with CDM Smith. Admittedly, they wanted me to take a look at the international arena. So I'll get to that in a minute. So I said, well, what about the U.S.? Let's take a look what we're doing. And right away, the comment was, oh, well, we're in the U.S. It's a clean country. And I said, but where do we work? We work with a lot of local and national and federal government space. We do a lot with municipal governments. And, it wouldn't be a stretch for us to Google search Louisiana politics and construction.
Right.
And you would find that there are some concerns. So a big risk for the U.S. was, doing our work with our municipalities, but more than that, making sure that our engineers and our sales guys who work with them understand that there are still protocols we need to follow. There are still risk areas. So they become friends with the water commissioner. I mean, CDM Smith does a lot of great work in the water space with water, trying to do water, wastewater treatment. So we become, we do get to know these communities we live in. That's what makes us so good at our job. But at some point you have to say, but be careful of that relationship, because if you and the mayor are out golfing all the time, not that this has happened, but seriously, you have to say, if you and the mayor are out doing this and then they award us a contract, what is the public perception going to look like? What is the appearance of propriety? So for us in the U.S., that is one of the biggest compliance risks.
Mm-hmm.
And adhering to the contract work that the local government tells us.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's look internationally.
Mm-hmm.
We do a lot of work in developing nations. So India, Vietnam. We used to be in China. We're not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I used to do work in China with another company. And, one of the risks there was not understanding the culture.
Mm-hmm.
The company that I was with, thought they knew it. But
Mm-hmm.
when it comes time for festivals, or let's take mooncakes, for example,
Mm-hmm.
highly common
Mm-hmm.
gifts. So gifts, entertainment. So you're trying to take a look at what's the culture of giving business courtesies and when does it cross the line into potential bribery or corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really difficult for people to understand, look, if you're going to give a $500 equivalent mooncake
Mm-hmm.
along with, some extravagant gifts with it, that's not appropriate. So let's look at, let's back it down.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other problem we had or could have is you want to send a U.S. national who understands the culture. At least this is when you're a U.S.-based company. So keep in mind, I'm talking from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So we would send a U.S. national who knew, for example, Mandarin, and we'd say, okay, this will be great. That guy, Joe, is going to make sure they follow our culture. But instead, Joe goes native, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You ever heard that comment?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, they come back and say, well, no, that's not really a problem. So our risks internationally is not understanding the culture and then taking for granted that a Western approach is going to be the right thing. That just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And so you're in these developing countries. Let's go to India. You have high poverty, and where you have high poverty, you have high corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And there are plenty of statistics out there to talk about, for every dollar that you spend, a third of, or for every, I can't recall it right now, World Bank usually posts the statistic about, for every trillion spent, a third of it goes to bribery and corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the risk, is in stepping back and saying, okay, as a consulting company, what do we need to look for? What do we need to do? And that's what ends up happening, is that we end up really trying to focus on the risks while at the same time working on the culture. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it difficult. Mm-hmm. I don't know, you've probably seen that as well.
Absolutely. And I am so glad that you touched on that point about the lower corruption perceptions countries sort of not receiving the attention that they should. I actually think that's one of the greatest risks that most companies have, is the overblown confidence that your so-called low-risk countries don't require much corruption attention from the compliance team, because in my experience, they've actually been some of the most difficult countries to deal with. And we've spoken about this before, which is my view is that a lot of those countries, they haven't grown up with bribery and corruption as part of their daily lives, and therefore it's so far removed. They think it's not that important to have to worry about, and therefore the compliance program doesn't apply to them. And there's a newsletter that I subscribe to. It's called Ethical Alliance, and not only does it cover a lot of the major FCPA cases that come up, but it also does a lot of the local United States ones at the municipal level, local government level. And it is very, very common for there to be bribery at the local level in the United States. And it's handing over sacks of cash. It's not even complicated schemes. And so, and another point related to that is with the release of the latest Corruption Perception Index, Canada is no longer showing as a very clean country, and it's the first time in I think 10 years that Canada is out of the top 10. And so we just have to keep this constant thought and mindset that just because something says, or you've got a belief, or someone else in the company has a belief that a certain area of your business is so-called clean, that doesn't mean don't turn over stones. It doesn't mean that you can avoid doing a risk assessment or training. you've still got to get into those areas, because in fact you might find that they are the ones harboring the worst skeletons in the closet.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what I've also found is in some of these developed nations, because they have this perception of everything is ethical and in alignment, people feel very comfortable.
Yes, I agree. The confidence is there because they assume that the surroundings are very clean and therefore everything must be fine.
Is strictly to look at this invoice, and I just need to make sure that everything is on the invoice that we need on the invoice. But if I say, okay, but does the amount on the invoice match the contract? Well, that's not my job. And these are developed nations that I've found people saying this. And I say, what do you mean it's not your job? Well, because it has to be signed off by the project manager. And if he signs off, he's already checked it. And I said, but what if the project manager is the same guy who hired them? And how would you know if you don't see the contract? I mean, we end up getting a failure. We don't have segregation of duties, which is a big issue. And then we end up having people saying, not my job. You need to write it in my job description. Because there is an assumption everybody's going to do the right thing. And unfortunately, these days, that's just not the case.
Totally agree. Great example.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about an initiative that you've implemented in your compliance program that has had a hugely positive impact?
Oh, sure. And this really is a thread that just keeps following from, this international and the accountability responsibility. So I can't take credit for having invented this idea, because the very first compliance officer I ever worked for is the one who told me about this and started it. And I've seen other companies do it, but essentially it's our compliance ambassador program. Because people who know me know, I will say compliance isn't owned by the compliance department. I think when I interviewed for this job at CDM Smith, and the CEO at the time said, okay, so how big a staff do you need? How many people do you have to hire? And I said, well, if I do my job well, not many at all. And they were floored, because the company was prepared to say, do whatever you need to do. And I said, look, if I have a staff of 20 people, you're going to rely on those 20 people to do this. That's not where compliance is. It has to be owned by the business. They have to be accountable for this. So I need the accounting person who's reviewing the invoice to stop and say, what are red flags? And the best way that I've seen to do that is to start with this concept of compliance ambassadors. So CDM Smith, we have two programs. The compliance ambassador program is people in a high-level position at all of our international locations. So the company has about 5,500 employees. I don't need a compliance manager at each one of our international locations, because some of them only have 20 people or less. And so that's an overhead cost. So instead, what I did, I approached the management team, and we were talking about how the program is going to be structured. And I said, here's my concept is I want this to be viewed as a leadership potential. I want people to be nominated because it's somebody who you do believe is trustworthy, high integrity, but we want to develop them as a leader, and they will be the focal point for compliance at that place. So we rolled it out with a big announcement. We have 11 people, and these are high-level people. These are country managers in these locations, along with quality managers. And only in one of the locations do I have a lawyer. Everyone else are non-lawyers.
Great.
And these are people that then deliver the message. And I go to those locations. I'm getting ready to head to one in a couple of weeks, and I'll meet with my compliance ambassador, and we'll do training together. But this has helped the business to own it. And then we've recently implemented compliance champions for our U.S. locations. Because in the U.S., it is different. I mean, we do have different risk needs. And the way our company is set up, we have about 80 offices throughout the U.S. Once again, I don't need 80 personnel, but instead we have utilized people who are in a leadership role in each one of these offices, and they've been tasked to be a compliance champion. And once again, those will be the people who will drive the message. They will be the face of compliance. Now, people always know they can call me. They always know they can call my team. But this initiative, everywhere that I've worked on it or seen it or done it, to me, that's one of the core facets of really embedding the program and getting the business to own it.
Mm-hmm. I've saw recently a quote about innovation and how to be a good innovator, you don't need to be the one coming up with the ideas. You just need to recognize a good one when you see it. And so
you got it.
what I love about your version of this, which I think is different to many of the others that I've heard of, is that you've made it a position of prestige. It's not just an add-on to someone else's regular duties. It's something that people want to reach for as a career advancement opportunity. I think that's awesome. Yes. Good for you.
Yeah.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, and we try to make it, one of the companies I worked for, we did it on a rotational, and I had people asking me for it. Can I be a compliance ambassador? I want to get that turn. And of course, that particular company, we actually bought them, jackets with a nice logo and stuff on it. We haven't gotten to the jacket phase, but we do have some pretty awesome compliance socks that we give people. Really awesome.
I will expect a pair of those socks in the mail.
You got it.
They sound awesome. All right. Well, moving on to another topic of your strength now. I happen to know that you are a compelling and engaging public speaker, but not because I've attended any of your sessions to date, which I might add makes me a terrible friend, but I'm also dying
not
to
at all.
I really want to. And I'm going to be looking out for you speaking in the near future so that I get to, because I have heard so many people rave about attending talks facilitated by you, which, your reputation really precedes you in this area. So being a strong public speaker is not something that comes easily to many people. It can be terrifying or simply not within the comfort zone of many. What steps did you take to work on your presence in front of an audience?
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Frankly, a part of it is genetics. My mom was a very strong woman. And if in growing up, you look at my parents, my mom was always the one doing the talking. So I probably inherited her gene for talking. But it is still scary. I'll admit, standing up in front of people in high school and college was a little intimidating. So I can probably credit the ability to do this well to two different people, to be quite frank. One is an undergrad professor. So my undergrad degree is in journalism. And at some point during that, one of the professors said, "Hey, would you be interested in broadcast journalism?" And I'm like, "Oh, heavens, no." I don't want my face in front of a camera. I'm like, ah. And they're like, no, we want you to work on this. So I took a class on public speaking and communication skills with a professor, the late Rex Mix. He's just a fabulous communicator. So he really helped me a lot with presence and with what makes an effective speech. And then eventually, as I said, I went to law school, and I had another fabulous professor, Earl Dudley, who was my trial advocacy professor. And I don't know if you've taken, any type of class like that, but that's really about how to present in front of a jury, in front of judges for appellate arguments. And he just gave me a technique that I use to this day. Is I take a manila folder, and in that manila folder, just whatever talk I give has to either be I usually increments of 4 because you have 4 sides to manila folder, and I will tape a piece of paper to each of the pages of the folder. And on the left side will be my outline, and on the right side might be some points that I want to bring out, so that I'm not reading. Reading a speech there are very few people who can read a speech and it's engaging. You really want to talk and have a dialogue. So I think a large part of what I do is to try to have this dialogue. But then, I always want to try to create something that people can relate to. So talking about compliance is one of the driest topics ever. Usually. I say it's right next to macrame. Apologies to my late mother who wanted to talk about, as you know what macrame is, making plant hangers out of yarn is what we would do. Just not something as a 70s child I really aspired to be. So you have to try to find a way to relate it to people. So when I make presentations, especially internationally, because I am not bilingual, I have a smattering of French, and that's about it. So I usually have to have, an interpreter if we need it. But fortunately, because of the type of work we do with engineers, consultants, most of them are bi and trilingual. So I can, talk to them, but I have to find a way to bring them in. And I grew up playing a lot of sports. Sports is big in my family, and that tends to be a common thread for people. So I'll often try to put up something about sports and talk about sports teams. The year the World Cup and all the FIFA stuff went on, that was great fodder for me. I could talk a lot about the importance of sports and a team, and here's your playbook, and what happens when you don't follow the playbook. And then you got pictures of all kinds of people who've, been in prison for the corruption.
Great.
So, I do that. And then I start saying, okay, let's talk about a code of business conduct. That's our playbook. This is how we know what the rules are. And so I try to do that. And that's probably what you've heard is, depending on what the topic is, I'm going to try to pull out a real life experience of some kind and try to make people think about it a little more. Because like you said, this goes right back to talking to people in the United States or, Canada at one point, Germany, to talking to them about compliance. And they say, yeah, I know, I'm going to do it. But then you have to break it down and say, look, this is about doing the right thing, about where you're going to fall down. And it starts small, right? Nobody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to embezzle 15 million from the company. It started small, and we're all responsible for trying to ensure that the person who is starting out small and charging expenses to the company that they shouldn't, and then getting access to accounts they shouldn't have. We're all responsible for ensuring that doesn't happen. So I think when I try to talk to people and relate it that way, that really helps. But it's always good, if people are hesitant and they say, I want to try to speak, take a presentation class. Our company is really wonderful about offering these development opportunities. And one of the guys that works for me, Steve Felt, took a presentation class. And I noticed the difference. I think he said too, he noticed he felt more confident. So
great.
If people want to do that, that's great. But there are people who don't, and that's fine too.
Oh, I know Steve, as you know. And so I will look forward to seeing him present sometime. That's great.
Oops, he's going to shake his head at me next time I say, I'm sorry, Steve.
In your spare time, you work a lot on your fitness. In fact, I believe you may have even listened to this very podcast once or twice while out for a run. How do you squeeze in the time to ensure a healthy body goes along with a sharp mind?
Well, it's not easy, but running is my mental health therapy. Running, if I didn't run, I'd probably drink a lot of alcohol. But when you have kids, a husband, dog, that is frowned upon in polite society. So actually, I started running just seriously with distances about 12, 13 years ago. And I found not only did I just feel better. Running works for me. It doesn't work for everybody, but it just worked for me. I also found this wonderful tribe of women who all run, all different speeds too. So part of it is, the importance of having a group, and importance of having a group of women who support you. And like me, they all work. So it's been very helpful to talk about how we fit in fitness. Personally, I like to do it in the morning, and I really have to do it in the morning or I won't get it done. So I go to bed, usually by 10, and I'm up between 5:30 and 6 because that's the only way I can do it. And if I miss a day, I try to figure out something else. But it is really common, I hate to say, especially in the winter, I'll wake up, my alarm goes off at 6, and I think, I just don't feel motivated. I just don't want to get up and go. But I have to stop and just tell myself, just 20 minutes of something. So while I might get up and think, I don't feel like running. So I go get on an exercise bike, or I do 20 minutes of yoga. I've got a lot of great yoga apps that I can do because I travel so much that have been helpful. Or you can get on elliptical. And then once just 20 minutes, it really is just got to push. Then you're like, oh, well, maybe I can get in 30. And that's all it takes is 20 to 30 minutes 3 times a week. So I tell people, start small, set small goals, And as you set those small goals, then you can go bigger and bigger. And I found not only did I really like running and enjoy it, but I started doing half marathons with some girlfriends, and the whole camaraderie of it was just so mentally healing. And I've done a few marathons here and there, which have been really amazing. And I find that, having that mental stamina to do that absolutely translates into my professional life, because not everything goes quickly. And like I said, lawyers don't have a chance to build something, but what we are building takes time. There's no immediate gratification. So it takes time to see how that culture is going. And I have to keep telling myself, okay, this is a marathon. This is what we have to do. So I just think, especially for women, we have to keep moving. As we get older, things just happen. You lose muscle mass, you lose flexibility. And so doing all of this is not only better for yourself, it's better for others. I mean, my kids and I have a joke that I'm going to be the running grandma. I'm going to take their kids on races. And two of my three children are really, really enjoy running. They run cross country, they run track. My oldest daughter is into volleyball. So all my family is very healthy and move, and that helps make it easy. But one more thing I have to throw in there is it's very, very fortunate that I work for a firm that has a wellness program. And it encourages you to record your steps and your miles. And it allows for some competition, which I won't deny is a big motivator for me. So if I'm laying in bed and I'm like, I think Graham Campbell's getting ahead of me. He's one of our executives. I think he's going to beat my step marker. I'm going to get up and make sure I can get there. So,
that's great.
So you got to find a way to motivate yourself. I know when we go to the SCCE conferences, they have little step counters and little things you can do, but it's so important. You have to make time for your mental health and your physical health, or the rest of it's just not going to work.
Great. Thank you. As a fat kid at heart, and literally sometimes my whole life, those tips are good for me to hear, and I'll be thinking of your words before my next workout. So thank you for those.
You're welcome. And listen to podcasts. Podcasts are good. I'm kind of geeky. I started out listening to music, but I also like to multitask. And so I like to know, I'm a knowledge junkie. I want to know what's going on. So podcasts are a good excuse. I don't feel like I'm wasting time if I'm listening to podcasts and run.
I agree. And I found also, in addition to podcasts on the rowing machine, I quite like putting TED Talks on instead of music. Great way to absorb more information. Awesome. Okay, so you referred earlier, and I think I referred too, about the interesting life you lead, where you're based in your home of Charlotte and CDM Smith's home / headquarters of Boston, and you shuttle between the two cities. And interestingly, you're not the first chief compliance officer I know of that does this. So I'd like to hear from you, what are some of the benefits of this lifestyle, if you will, and how do you make it work to overcome the downsides?
Yeah, so it's not always easy. And as I relayed earlier, this was a family decision. And fortunately, my company was able to make it work. But there's a couple things at play here. So first, personally, the biggest downside is I miss my family. My husband and two of my three children are in Charlotte. So it's tough, but we do have a lot of technology, FaceTime and that sort of thing. And as my husband says to me, he says, when you're not here during the week, they're being regular teenagers anyway, so you're not missing anything. But I was like, oh, okay, I don't miss the drama. But you do. So you have to find a way to just handle that. And I do. The upside is, now my oldest daughter, who has now graduated college and is an engineer in Boston. So I get to see her. So you have to find that silver lining with regard to where you're going to work. Thankfully, I couldn't do this without my husband, who's my partner, and he knows I love to work. People say to me, have you always worked? I have, because that's just who I am. My kids see me healthy, my girls especially. See that I do have a family, I do have a job I love, and it's always a balance, it's always a juggle, but they see you can do it. And there's give and take everywhere you do this. So, again, because my husband, when I started doing this commuting to Boston, I just stayed in hotels. But we started taking a look at first of all, it's Boston, and hotel prices can jack up to $600 a night.
Right.
Well,
in
if
summer.
I'm up there, yes, exactly. So if I'm there, 14 nights a month, good golly, that's a lot of money. So we started looking, and I found a nice little apartment, just a little one bedroom, and it's right on the water because I love the water. And I don't live, Charlotte is not as close to the water as people think.
Right.
To drive a few hours. So we kind of found a way to make it mine, to make it feel like home to me. And of course, it's decorated the way I want. It's my personal she shed. So when I get to my place, I know the spoons are always going to be there. The cups are put away. It's clean. So that's kind of the upside.
Right.
And then one other personal thing that's kind of funny is, my friends, I've been married to my husband now. It'll be 20 years this October. And people say, how do you guys have such a great marriage? I'm like, well, because we only see each other half the time. Okay, of course, that's not ideal. Right. But we did say, look, we need to find a way for me to re-enter life when I come back here without stepping on his toes, but making him feel like he's important. So we have date night. I fly home on Friday nights. And he picks me up and we go to our favorite restaurant and have a date night. And we would not have started that had I not been doing this back and forth thing. So that's the personal side of how you make it work. Professionally, here's the deal. When I interviewed for this job, I told the gentleman when they said, how many people do you need? What kind of budget do you need? I said, the single biggest line item in my budget is travel. Because if I do my job well, I'm not sitting behind a desk all day.
Right.
I'm going to be in the field. So the fact that I'm, my kids are used to me traveling, but professionally, even if I wasn't in Charlotte, sometimes, like I'm heading to Australia or I'm heading to our offices in Denver. So it's not for everybody. Not everybody has the freedom and the ability to go everywhere. But I do think if you have a global company and you're the chief compliance officer, you have to be in the trenches hearing what people are doing and how they're doing it. We had one location, we were doing work and it was considered, a pretty decent, it's in the United Arab Emirates. And most people say, if you work with Emiratis, they're very clean. I mean, they really do not engage in corruption, partially because the law is so harsh and partially because as a government employee, you get paid really well. So there's no incentive to take bribes, right? So initially people said, Beth, the work there is fine. So I went to one of our project sites and I sat down and talked to our engineers. Well, most of our engineers are not Emirati citizens. They're from India or Singapore or Taiwan or Pakistan. So as we start talking to them, I said, well, what about our partners? What about subcontractors? Well, guess what? They are also not from the Emirates. They're from somewhere else. So as I talked to them and said, tell me about your risks. Tell me what you encounter. We finally had one gentleman, very soft-spoken, who mentioned to me that he had an issue with an inspector. We were building a road. And an inspector, he said, hey, we're done. We need you to come inspect it. So the inspector isn't hired by us, hired by the client, but it's another company. And essentially the inspector was asking him for money to give him a good inspection report.
Right.
And our guy knew because we had trained them, we had talked to them. He said, no, we can't do this. No. And so as he's talking through them, as this guy's, he's talking to this other person and then, the project lead is there and he said, well, why didn't you tell me this? And he said, because I'm expected to handle these. And I said, so where is it now? And he said, well, he still keeps asking and I think it's going to be, he's going to make life difficult. And I was like, oh my goodness. So we talked to him and brought it up and said, look, you need to bring it to your team lead and we need to do this and do that. Nobody would have ever known that without me sitting there and talking. So there's that value. I know it's not a direct answer to your question.
No, it's good.
The back and forth. But I do believe it's important as a compliance professional to know your client. And my client is this firm.
Absolutely. And I think anecdotally, we all seem to know as compliance professionals that to be the most effective at your job, you've got to be in the field or in the trenches and getting that face time. But unfortunately, whenever the company that you work for is in some kind of financial difficulty or, cuscotting for whatever reason, the first thing to go is often travel. And I would love if there was some kind of empirical evidence behind concretely how that affects the job of compliance officers, because I think we know it does. I'm just not sure that we've necessarily got the data to back it up. And I think that'd be cool if we had access to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good point.
As you were starting off with that story, I was kind of in shock because I used to work in the UAE. And I can't recall, I can't recall a single colleague being a local, and I can't remember any of our third parties that I would train for compliance being an Emirati either. And so you're very much right. It was very diverse in other respects, but one of the missing pieces of representation out there is in fact the UAE locals themselves. You don't necessarily always see them. In fact, the most I would see the locals when I lived in Dubai would be when I would enter the country, because working the immigration desks, it was always UAE nationals, and that would be the biggest concentration. So interesting. I'm glad that you got to the bottom of it. I think that ties back to a point that we made earlier. People have preconceived ideas as to where there is corruption and where there is not corruption. And the truth of the matter is there is freaking corruption everywhere. And we need to be really alert to that in our jobs. We know that some places are higher risk than others, and proportionately they demand more attention. But also the places that you may not be so concerned about, they also require something to be done as well. And what I see, the interesting thing about compliance, as I've been a compliance officer and been on this executive team, because I report directly to our CEO and to the board, I find that as I look at our company strategy and what we're doing, compliance is probably one of the few areas in a company where you don't want to have trade secrets. You don't want to protect or keep quiet what you're doing from others. There needs to be collective action among everyone. The standards need to be the same for everyone. And once you start doing that, that's when these other countries will get in line. We do a lot of work with the World Bank, and I've spoken at a few of their forums. When they talk to these other countries who are potential donors. And that's the theme that seems to be lacking right now, is people all know we need to do it, but they're not quite sure how to go about it. So when we have organizations like SCCE, where we have a lot of people who can collectively discuss, that's the only way I think this is going to keep moving that pendulum forward. Because transparency is not a bad thing. That's only going to help every company, regardless of the industry. I think that's right. And there's no limitation. One of my favorite parts of working in this field is that though many of us have been in previous lives, I used to be in antitrust, where all I would do is preach all day about not talking to competitors and sharing secrets. We are so lucky in compliance that it's one of the few areas where we have very little to worry about in terms of antitrust risk from talking to competitors, sharing, and I can't even think, I'm sure one of our listeners could think very hard and come up with something and get back to me on this, but I can't think of anything where by sharing compliance best practices and talking about our standards with each other is going to be problematic from a legal risk perspective.
Right. I agree.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Beth. Before we close out this episode, I'll just share a little nugget from attending a diversity and inclusion event that Hogan Lovells put on recently in DC, and they themselves are doing a lot in this field, but I wanted to focus this tip on what came out from their client panel. And one of their clients explained a really easy way in which she holds her external counsel accountable for promoting diversity inclusion. And all that she does is she will ask them to report back on the diversity and inclusion of the project team that was working on her case. And she'll also let them know my expectation is that there is a diverse team working on this job. And I thought that was a really quick, easy, and painless way to promote diversity and inclusion and make sure that it is being respected in terms of the counsel that we seek. And of course, this can be applied to your other external services areas as well, such as consultants that you may use. So a little something to keep in mind to perhaps maybe give a try if you're not doing already. Thank you again to Beth for her time and for Sarah Haddon at Corporate Compliance Insights for sponsoring this episode.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.